Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm gonna also give you a little bit of a macro perspective of a certain part of our data set that has been very new for the 2022 edition. And particularly, we're going to look at unity or new cleavage in European politics as the war in Ukraine is presenting itself. Okay, so let's just see. Oh, no. So these are the main questions that we're going to ask. And so maybe let me tell you just right up front that how the public thinks about the Ukraine war is actually an important question. And the reason is that there are not enough European Union mechanisms of how to react in the war. And so how the public carries the reactions to the war is actually quite an important determinant here. So that's kind of where we are coming from in this presentation. I want to give you a little bit of an overview. And these are the questions that we ask. What is the support across European countries? And in our sample of 17 from the 2022 edition with 23,000 respondents. But we're also going to add a second wave to that was conducted actually in September of last year in order to see a little bit the continuity of the support. Okay, so that will be a nice addition to what we have. This second wave was only asked in 10 of the original EU countries that were included in our sample, but also in a more global kind of sample. We developed particularly suitable measures for the support for Ukraine regarding its war and invasion that we are trying to ask repeatedly. And now we are working on the third wave that is going to be out in the field in a few weeks. We here will be talking about some individual and country level factors as they relate to support for Ukraine. I'm not going to go into very detailed models that we're going to do for academic presentations, but give you rather an overview of some of the factors that we consider overall. Okay, so that's the data set. We've been talking already about its structure and the second wave and how we're going to test the different factors. So let's start with the first set of overview. Here, where we look at some of the country-related factors. And well, first of all, on the first section, I actually want to just give you an overview of how the support for Ukraine is distributed across Europe, and then also more globally as we see it in the second wave, and whether there are any changes between the first and the second wave. So as you can see here, here we have plotted and it's very difficult to plot all the different data points, but it gives you an overview of the overall distribution of our sample countries. We here highlight the means of the overall sample, but you also see how countries are being distributed. And really, as you can see here, there's overall extremely high support for supporting Ukraine, okay? But that support differs very much according to what we are asking about. So the highest support is really about sending humanitarian aid and allowing refugees into the countries and allowing refugees to enter the labor market. So these are kind of the really above 75% of the entire sample thinks that is positive and should be done. There's much more division about sending weapons to Ukraine, fast-tracking EU membership, and some of the other indicators that we see here. Okay, so I'm just here, sorry, I lost my notes. Okay, let's move on. So, for example, on EU membership, we have just above 50%. And the two items that are most critical in this European sample are accepting higher energy costs and sending troops to join the war, which is, of course, a very high cost element of help. If you look at this help across countries, we do see that the unity that is often portrayed in the media, and that maybe we also see when we look overall at the data over time, that this unity is really a little bit undermined by some strong differences between countries. As you can see here, the leaders of the support for Ukraine are really in Scandinavia and in some Eastern European countries that are particularly close to Russia, like Lithuania and Poland. But much, much less support exists in a country like Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, and Greece. So these are kind of the laggards, if you will, of support. And in two of these countries, we even have, below a majority, below the 50% of support overall. And so let's look at how does this relatively high support look like when we add another second wave. As I said, the second wave was only conducted of these original countries that we have in 10 of them. And YouGov told me that 2 of these countries, Greece and Hungary, we should be a little bit careful about drawing any conclusions because the sampling strategy there was very different, whereas the other countries can be more compared with their earlier variants. So so happens that the support is also lowest in these 2 countries, Greece and Hungary. But if you look at this graph, it is showing you the changes on these various items per country. And the overall impression looking at this graph is that there is overall relatively little change, right? And that's, I would have liked to ask you to guess it, but probably people thought there would be much more drop in the overall support, right? And that is also what we hypothesized, but really we see very little change. Surely, I think overall we see a downward trend, and I'm going to show you that downward trend a little bit better in the following graphs. But that is also to be expected because of ceiling effects. The support was already extremely high. It cannot really move very much in the other direction. We see especially decreases in these high levels of support for humanitarian aid. We also see some decreases for supporting refugees to enter the country. Almost in all of the countries, we see some minor decreases here. Although the acceptance of energy costs, which are also expected to be a high salient issue that is very, very controversial, is relatively stable. We'll talk about the exceptions very soon. And EU membership of Ukraine as a discussion point got even a slight kick up over the last month of the war. So that's kind of, there are some surprising results then when we look at this. So let's look at this a little bit differently. And here I pulled out some countries for you that have a certain profile. So Denmark is one of the few countries where we see a lot of more positive changes than in other countries. So for example, we see a change, and so this is a change model. It gives you only the changes between the one wave and the other, and everything on the right side is a positive change and everything on the left side is a negative change, okay? And so what you see here is a tremendous rise in support for Danish people for the EU membership in Ukraine, and that can be traced back in part to the Danish government being very active with the Ukrainian government, having very individualized meetings, pushing ahead on these kind of diplomatic issues and talking actively about EU membership. On all the other items, these changes are rather small, and Denmark is a rather stable case. Germany is interesting because Germany has often been portrayed as a controversial supporter of Ukraine and kind of being kind of the party pooper here and trying a country that is trying to resist some of the positive changes, particularly in the delivery of weapons. Here we see also in Germany some of the declines over the 2 period, and particularly a decline of the acceptance of higher energy costs is particularly high in Germany. It's an 8-point change. that is significant, but we also see some significant drop in other issues, such as sending humanitarian aid and accepting refugees. So the German public really is questioning much more. And if you really are from Germany, then you know why. There's a lot of discussions in the media. A lot of people are disgruntled with the high energy prices and feel that, you know, the Germans should come first and then we should think about others and so on. There is some sort of shift in solidaristic thinking in some parts of the German population. And we see that reflected here in our overtime data. I have here as the last example, Spain. Spain was relatively high on the support in the first wave. And we see here also in Spain rather a drop in most of our indicators, and particularly in weapon support, for example, but also in other indicators such as sending humanitarian aid and refugees. So different profiles that we can draw on, and you know, I cannot really present all of these to you here, but there is an interesting story to be told about the domestic dynamics of the support. Here I can just talk in very broad brush ways of our data, but I wanted to also take the opportunity to introduce to you the second wave. And this is the second wave in its full kind of sample. It is a real global sample that includes not just Western democracies from Europe as we had before, but also some Western democracies in North America, such as Canada, and the US, as well as many other countries, democracies around the world, as well as non-democracies. And what this graph is really showing, that in terms of the public anyway, this war in Ukraine is really the show of the Western democracies. Okay, they are the strongest defenders of Ukraine. They are the strongest people standing behind Ukraine here in this war. And there's much, much less support when we think about it globally. And when we go into the global publics and, you know, also, of course, with farther distance away from the conflict, but not only that, there are differences there. There's also farther away countries that are relatively supportive, such as Kenya, for example, or Nigeria. But much less support there is in Indonesia, Turkey, including Hungary, a country in Europe. Although again, that's with a question mark there in terms of the data reliability. Egypt and Thailand as kind of the laggards here. So what trend I see is Western democracies ahead, but also in general, democracies are much more supportive than non-democracies. Okay, let's look at this worldwide support by items so that we can also see. And interestingly enough, because this is a global sample that also includes the Western democracies that we had before, the dominance or salience of these items kind of lines up very similarly. Sending humanitarian aid is the highest and sending troops the lowest, but it's on a much lower scale overall. The laggards that we see, again, are the countries that we outlined before, especially Indonesia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are on the more questionable side, even with regard, for example, to humanitarian aid or relatively simple forms of help. But there is much more support from also the European countries when it comes to doubting sending weapons. That's quite contested, and also acceptance of higher energy crisis. It's not just the non-democracies or non-Western democracies, but also European countries that are doubting that. So let's move on to a more analytical framework, although again, in broad brushes here only. For academic papers, we'll go much more into the detail. So for our first analysis, we look at some Russia-related indicators, the closeness to Russia overall, whether people perceive a threat from Russia, whether there is a religious or a general closeness to Russia, some sort of positive evaluation of Russia overall before the war. Of course, the classic argument about the oil and gas dependency needs to be integrated into our analysis set. But we have also tried to look at Russian disinformation that is penetrating worlds differently. And it's very difficult to measure this. We'll come back to that. But we're also going to look at some domestic factors that I would call generally the domestic contestations. How contested is the support for the Ukrainian war domestically is a very important topic. And we will look at that and then look at some individual level factors as well. So I cannot talk about all the details here. You can certainly ask in the question and answer period. But first of all, the oil and gas dependency here is not a very strong correlate at the aggregate level for explaining the support. There is a little bit of going in the right direction on some of this, but it is not really an important factor, and it falls completely out of any modeling analysis. If we build, for example, multi-level models, the gas and oil dependency is not really explaining what we see. We try to look at relationships with Russia before the war. Now, we don't have the best measures yet. That's something that we are still working on. Here, we took something that captures this to a certain degree, which is the evaluation of Russia before the war in a completely unrelated data set. And we see a very strong relationship here between kind of a positive view of Russia, a positive view of Putin, and the current attitude about aiding and supporting Ukraine. Okay, very, very strong support. And then our last item here is the relationship between Russian misinformation, how it penetrates different countries and support for Ukraine. And here we have developed some measures for the second wave that we have been able to use on the new sample. So for example, trying to understand three myths about Ukraine, whether Russians were subjected to a genocide in Ukraine before the war started, whether the government is under the influence of militant extremists of Hitler, Nazism, and the Western influence in Ukraine, and believing more in these types of misinformation or disinformation campaigns that clearly can be traced back to Russia also determines very strongly the support overall in a global sample. Okay, I don't have much time left, so I'm just going to talk about a few things here at the end. When we look at the domestic polarization, we really see just a little bit of polarization. So mostly what we see is kind of a rally around the flag effect that mostly, though not everywhere, incumbent or supporters of incumbent parties are more supportive of the Ukraine measures than opposition parties. And so you see this in red here, the red dots are incumbent parties, but that's not everywhere the case. But it is mostly the case. But there is a significant number of countries where also the opposition parties are more supportive. But that overall trend is telling us if maybe the opposition parties were to take over, that we potentially would see some sort of change, so that change, it is not a strong change that we see here, but there could be some changes according to public pressures. And here my final insight before I move on to the conclusion is on the left-right dimension. Here is a left-right placement that we use. We will also do this with parties later, and we're also going to have a link to the standing of parties. So we have an expert survey that we will be linking to their party stances on Ukraine. And what we see here is a very mixed picture, actually, that there are some countries where the radical left is more supportive. In some Eastern European countries, that is less so the case because they are often still very Russia supportive, whereas on the right, we often see less support, but that is also sometimes substituted in these countries, in these Eastern European countries as well. So there are differences. There is not one middle fits all, but we do see a certain polarization in the countries that have least support for Ukraine overall. We see more polarization on the left and right. Okay, here I wanted to look at whether polarization has changed over time. We don't have time for that and the relationship to democracy, but I'm just gonna wrap this up and tell you basically that older people are more supportive of the Ukraine aid overall than younger ones. There is some relationship with experiences of the Cold War and the role of Russia and the Soviet Union there. There is a lot of resources that go into education really matters economically, economic standing matters. But our indicators of incumbency also hold up in a multivariate model and in a multi-level model, even where we also integrate some macro measures. What is really one of the most important individual level factors is the support for democracy measured in various ways. In terms of supporting executive aggrandizement, or rather being against it, as well as support for democracy. There are some differences I don't have time to go into, but also a strong relationship to the European Union. The people who support the European Union most are also more supportive of Ukraine. Okay, so that's what we think we should do in the future. We will follow the continuity of the support into a longer period. We'll better measure historical ties with Russia to explore this argument more. Go more into the domestic contestation, and that we also look at coalition governments, whether they react differently than one-party governments, for example. Link our indicators to expert surveys and party positions to understand the queuing effects that we see between the public and party leaders, and link the support of Ukraine to actual outcomes in terms of policy, whether the support, for example, for sending weapons also translates into the actual support that governments are following through with sending weapons, or with how many refugees enter the country. So these are the future facets of our research. Thanks for your
Thank you,
support.
Thank you.